Quick, when I say ancient mummy, what do you picture? Egypt, right? Pyramids? Bandages? Tutankhamun. Maybe 3,000 years ago. Gold mask. Stone sarcophagus. Here is the problem. The oldest mummies on Earth are not Egyptian. They are not even from the same continent. And they are more than 7,000 years older than anything the pharaohs ever buried. They were not dug up last year. They were dug up 100 years ago by a French woman with a pipe and a kerosene lamp in the limestone hills of northern Vietnam. She wrote about them in 1927. Nobody listened. For 10 decades, those bodies sat in museum drawers, catalogued, photographed, forgotten. Then in September 2025, a Taiwanese researcher in Australia ran one new test, and every textbook on Earth had to be rewritten. This is the story of the oldest deliberate burial ritual ever found. The story of who performed it, who buried it under a century of silence, and why we almost missed it. Stay with me, because the part that will haunt you is not the bones. It is the fact that we already had them. We just refused to see. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was assumed. For most of the 19th century, and almost all of the 20th, Western archaeology told one story. Civilization began in two places: the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley. Everything else came later. Everywhere else was a borrower. Africa was a cradle. Europe was a workshop. The Americas were an experiment. And Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, was framed as a kind of cultural cul-de-sac, a green, humid waiting room, a place where ideas arrived, not where ideas were born. This was not science. This was a story dressed as science. A story written by colonial scholars in colonial capitals for colonial audiences, and like all stories, it decided in advance what the evidence was allowed to mean. Then in 1899, a French geologist sailed for Indochina. Her name was Madeleine Colani. She was 33 years old. She was unmarried. She was determined to do field science in a discipline that did not want women in the field. She would spend the next 44 years in the limestone karsts of northern Vietnam. She would not return to France. In 1920, at the age of 54, she became the first woman in France to earn a doctorate in natural sciences. 6 years later, she walked into a cave called Sao Dong in Hoabinhian province, with a notebook and a kerosene lamp. What she found there did not fit the story she had been taught. Picture her. 60 years old, trousers caked in red mud, hair tied back under a wide straw hat. Her sister Eleanor waits at the cave mouth with hot tea. Colani is on her hands and knees, sweeping limestone dust away from a curve of bone. She has dug 9 rock shelters in 6 years. Each one tells the same quiet story. The dead were not thrown into pits. They were arranged, bound, knees folded against the chest, arms tight to the sides, like sleeping children, like babies before birth. And on the bones, on the cheekbones, on the chest, sometimes on the small bones of the hands, she finds red, ochre, the same iron-rich pigment that Neanderthals used in Europe, that Cro-Magnons brushed onto cave walls at Lascaux, that Aboriginal Australians have pressed into burial sand for 50,000 years. The same color, the same association, the same wordless instinct. The dead deserve to be marked. In her 1927 monograph, she writes a single sentence that should have changed history. In French, Les sépultures se présentent dans une attitude contractée. Les genoux ramenés contre la poitrine, comme si on avait voulu rendre mort la position du fœtus. In English, the burials present themselves in a contracted attitude, knees drawn to the chest, as if one had wished to restore to the dead the position of the fetus. Read that again. As if one had wished to restore to the dead the position of the fetus. 26 years later, another cave, another door slammed in archaeology's face. It is the 7th of February, 1958. Borneo, Sarawak. The west mouth of Niah Cave is so vast it has its own weather. Bats hang in clouds from a ceiling you cannot see. A British man named Tom Harrison is running an excavation here. He is an amateur. He is also a former special operations officer who parachuted into Borneo during the war. He is theatrical. He is impossible. He keeps a pet orangutan named Bullet at the Sarawak Museum. His wife Barbara, German-born, 23 years younger than him, does most of the careful digging. A workman in a trench they have nicknamed Hell, 2.5 meters deep, hot, suffocating, strikes something hard. He thinks it is a coconut. It is not a coconut. It is a skull, jammed upside down into the mud, anatomically modern. Gray seal. A teenager, maybe 15, maybe 17 years old. Barbara crawls down with a trowel and brushes the mud away from a young face that has been waiting for her in the dark for 40,000 years. Tom writes the announcement himself in the Sarawak Museum Journal. Until last week, the oldest known human skull from the entire continent was less than 12,000 years old. Now, suddenly, we have one that is more than 3 times that age. The history books will have to be rewritten. The history books did not have to be rewritten, because the academic world refused. The dating was attacked. Tom was called a self-promoter. The Harrisons were accused of digging carelessly. Some critics suggested, without evidence, that the skull had been planted. The find was effectively shelved for 40 years. 40 years of bones, sitting in a drawer, waiting to be allowed to speak. It would take a Cambridge team, returning to Niah in the early 2000s, redigging the same trench with modern stratigraphy to confirm what Barbara had known the moment she lifted the skull out of hell. The Harrisons were right. The continent had been wrong. And by the time the apology was issued, both of them were dead. While the world argued about Niah, the evidence kept accumulating. In silence, Con Cave in Tanha province, lower burial layer dated between 15,000 and 9,000 years before present. 7 bodies, all flexed, all sprinkled with red ochre. Con Ngua, also in Tanha. Excavated first in 1979, reopened in 2013 by the Australian archaeologist Marc Oxenham, who lifted out 146 skeletons in a single season. The total at Con Co Ngua now stands at 246 burials, about 250 human beings, buried over a span of roughly 2,000 years, all in the same impossible position. Heels pressed against the buttocks, knees pressed against the buttocks, knees pressed against the chest, arms folded inward, a position so tight that the body has to be bound. A position so deliberate that there is no way it was an accident. Imagine the room where this happened. A Hoabinhian dwelling 9,000 years ago. Bamboo walls. Thatched roof. Smoke from a small hearth in the corner. A woman has died. Maybe a mother. Maybe 28 years old, which was old then. Her family does not bury her that day, or the next day, or the next week. They wash her. They fold her, gently, into the curled shape she had inside her own mother. They bind her with rattan cord, wrists, ankles, knees. They lift her onto a low bamboo platform, and then, for weeks, they keep a fire burning beneath her. Not a hot fire, a patient one. Low embers of hardwood. Children play nearby. Meals are cooked on the same hearth. Daily, a daughter or a sister kneels and tends the coals. The smoke rises through her body, through skin, through muscle, through the small spaces between the bones. Water leaves. Decay never starts. This is not horror. This is not technology. This is something older than both. This is love. Slow. Daily. Patient. A refusal to let go of someone all at once. When the body is finally dry, 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, they paint her cheekbones with red ochre. They place a stone tool on her chest, and they lower her into the floor of the cave where her grandmother is buried, and her great-grandmother, and the great-grandmother before that. The archaeologists who found her in 1979 wrote one line in their field notebook. Primary flexed burial in unusual position. 5 words. A polite shrug. A label that said, "We do not know what to do with this, so we will pretend it is ordinary." They had no idea what they were looking at. And here's what makes it worse. The same shrug was written, in slightly different handwriting, in field notebooks across the entire region, for almost 100 years. Con Mung, 1976. Flexed burial. Unusual posture. Bao Du, Central Vietnam, 1985. Tight crouched burial. Position atypical. Gua Kha, Rock Shelter, in Malaysia, 1954. Bent burial. Maros, Sulawesi, 1969. Hyperflexed inhumation. Every excavator saw the same thing. Every excavator filed it under the same useless category. None of them, not one, asked the question that would have changed everything. Why this shape? Why this care? And why, across thousands of kilometers of jungle and karst and island, are total strangers all burying their dead in the exact same impossible position? It would take one woman in a different lab on a different continent to finally ask it out loud. Move forward to 2017. A humid storage room at the Institute of Archaeology in Hanoi. Fluorescent tubes flicker. Hours of cardboard boxes climb to the ceiling. Each box contains the bones of a person whose name nobody alive has ever spoken. A Taiwanese researcher named Hsiao-chun Hung stands in front of an open box. Inside it, curled tight, lies a 9,000-year-old skeleton from the central Vietnamese site of Bao Du. Hung was raised in Taiwan. She grew up hearing her grandmother's stories of Aboriginal funeral practices in the mountains. Slow smoke, bound bodies, a way of grieving older than any nation. She turns to her colleague, the Japanese physical anthropologist Hirofumi Matsumura, and she asks one question. Could these be similar to the smoked mummies of Papua New Guinea? That is the whole sentence. 12 words. No theater. No press conference. Nobody in the room realizes that the question has just ended a century of polite confusion, because here is what Hung knows that her predecessors did not. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, a people called the Anga still smoke dry their dead. The same flexed binding, the same slow fire, but the same red ochre. The technique is still alive. It has never died, and it does not leave the obvious signs of burning that early archaeologists were trained to look for. No charred bones, no scorch marks, just microscopic changes in the crystal structure of the bone itself. For 8 years, Hung's team examines 54 burials from 95 candidate sites across 11 countries. They use X-ray diffraction, Fourier transform, infrared spectroscopy, tools the Harrissons could not have imagined, tools Colani would have wept to see. They are looking for one thing, a tiny rearrangement of the calcium phosphate crystal lattice inside the bone, a signature that appears only when human tissue is held at low heat, 200 to 300 degrees Celsius, for weeks at a time. Site after site, the signal lights up. Vietnam, Laos, southern China, the Philippines, Borneo, Java, 12,000 years ago, and 12 Devi. 11,000 years ago. 10. The map of primary flexed burials in unusual position turns into a map of something else, something the textbooks did not have a word for until now. On the 15th of September, 2025, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences publishes a paper titled Earliest Evidence of Smoke-Dried Mummification, more than 10,000 years ago in southern China and Southeast Asia. Lead author, Hsiao-chun Hung. Within 72 hours, the story is everywhere. The Guardian. Live Science. Phys.org. Anthropology Net. Archaeology Magazine. Headlines in 11 languages. The numbers are what break people. The oldest deliberate Egyptian mummy, about 4,500 years old. Tutankhamun, about 3,300 years old. The Chinchorro mummies of northern Chile, which had held the world's oldest title for half a century, about 6,500 years old. The Hoabinhian smoke-dried mummies, at least 12,000 years old. Possibly 14. That is more than 7,000 years older than Egypt, 5,000 years older than Chile, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than the domestication of rice, older than every single technology your school textbook called the beginning of civilization. Sit with that gap. 12,000 years ago to Tutankhamun is a span longer than all of recorded history. Tutankhamun is closer in time to you, watching this on a screen, than to those mummies in the karsts of Vietnam. The people who made them did not have farming. They did not have pottery. They did not have a written language. They did not have a city, a state, a king, or a temple. What they had was a family and a fire, and the patience to keep that fire burning for 6 weeks because someone they loved had stopped breathing, and they were not yet ready to say goodbye. This is the moment in the story where I want you to feel the gap with your whole chest. Because we have been trained, all of us, to imagine civilization as something measurable. Walls, tablets, granaries, pyramids stacked, stone on stone. We measure ancient cultures by the things they built that lasted. But what these people built did not last in stone. It lasted in the body, in a way of grieving, in the knowledge that a corpse is not garbage, that a mother is not finished, the moment her heart stops, that the dead can be carried with you, dried by your own fire, into the next season of your life. That is a civilization, too. We just never had a word for it, because the word civilization was invented by people who did not see it. And here is the bitterest part. The discovery of 2025 was not really a discovery. The bones were already on the shelves. Colani's photographs were already in the archives. The Niah skull was already vindicated. Con Co Ngua had been excavated twice. The data had been waiting, patiently, for 100 years. What changed was not the evidence. What changed was the question we were willing to ask. Think about the shape of this story. For 100 years, the evidence sat in drawers because nobody asked the right question. A French woman saw it in 1927 and was politely ignored. A British couple proved it in 1958 and were attacked. An Australian dig in 2013 catalogued it. An Australian dig in 2013 catalogued it and moved on. A Taiwanese woman in 2017 asked 12 words. 8 years later, the textbooks broke. The mummies were never lost. We were just not looking with the right eyes. That is the part of this story I want you to keep. Not the dates, not the gap with Egypt, not the headlines. Just this. Somewhere, right now, in a museum drawer in your city, the most important discovery of the next decade is already sitting on a shelf. Already photographed. Already catalogued. Already waiting. It is waiting for one person to walk past it and ask a question nobody else has thought to ask. That person could be a tenured professor. It could also be a curious teenager with a library card and a refusal to take the textbook at its word. Because the lesson of the Hoabinhian mummies is not really about prehistory. It is about us. About every framework we have inherited that quietly decides in advance what we are allowed to see. About every obvious answer that turns out to be the assumption of an older generation dressed up in the costume of fact. What story are you carrying around in your head right now? About your country? About your ancestors? About your own potential? That was written by someone who never asked the right question. What if you asked it? The next time you light incense at a family altar, the next time you watch a grandmother bow to a photograph, the next time someone in your family folds their hands over a body and refuses, for one more day, to let go. Remember, you are doing something 12,000 years old. Older than every empire, older than every nation, older than every word for love in every language ever spoken. You are doing what the people of the Karsts did, tending the fire, keeping the body close, refusing to surrender to forgetting. And speaking of refusing to forget, let me leave you with one more body, far from any cave, far from any tropical karst. 350 BC in a cold Danish peat bog. A long wooden warship slides into the dark water and sinks, 20 meters long. Built plank by hand. Sealed at the seams with dark sticky resin. Pressed into one of those seams on the day of construction is a single human fingerprint. 2,400 years old. Still ridged, still readable. The fingerprint of a person who has been waiting in the peat for someone to come find them. Dendy Laboratory in Copenhagen. Right now, scientist Creed Dory Firsten Tang for that is a fire for the next night.